Ananya thought marrying James would mark the beginning of a beautiful new life. But a forbidden affair with his father, Charles, turned their wedding night into a scene of betrayal, obsession, and double murder. Ananya grew up in Mumbai in a family that valued tradition but also encouraged ambition. She was bright, elegant, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who knew her life was meant for more than the ordinary. Her parents often spoke of marriage as an important milestone, but they never pressured her, wanting her to find happiness on her own terms. When she met James, an Australian businessman visiting India for work, everything seemed to align. Their first meeting was brief but memorable, and soon afterward, James reached out to her through mutual friends. What began as casual conversations quickly turned into something more. He was charming, attentive, and unlike anyone she had ever met. James's life in Australia was comfortable and well established. He came from a wealthy family, with his father Charles being a respected figure in the business community. James had inherited not only privilege but also ambition, and he traveled often, blending work with exploration. When he met Ananya, he was captivated by her intelligence and warmth. The two began a long-distance relationship, exchanging calls late into the night and planning visits whenever their schedules allowed. Each trip deepened their connection, making the idea of marriage seem less like a fantasy and more like a natural step forward. When James proposed during one of his visits to India, Ananya's family celebrated wholeheartedly. They saw him as a stable, successful partner who would provide their daughter with a life filled with opportunities. Preparations for the wedding began almost immediately. Plans were made for a grand ceremony in Australia, blending Indian traditions with Western elegance. Relatives from both sides eagerly anticipated the event. Excited by the cultural union that seemed to symbolize love without borders, Ananya herself felt a mix of emotions. She was thrilled at the prospect of starting a new chapter, but beneath her excitement was a quiet nervousness about leaving behind the familiar world she had always known. Still, she reassured herself that James was worth the leap. He spoke often of building a life together, of a home filled with warmth, and of adventures they would share as husband and wife. His promises made her believe she was stepping into something extraordinary. When she arrived in Australia before the wedding, she was welcomed with open arms. James's family treated her with kindness and respect, eager to integrate her into their lives. The celebrations leading up to the big day were lavish. Friends and relatives filled the house, laughter and music spilling into every corner. Photographers captured her radiant smile as she wore her bridal attire, while James stood proudly beside her, the perfect picture of a devoted groom. To everyone watching, it was a storybook romance. A young woman from India finding love across continents, a union celebrated by two families and embraced by the community. The air was thick with joy, as though the future stretched ahead like a golden road with nothing but promise. But beneath the surface of this perfect image, shadows lingered. Secrets had already begun to take root, secrets that would twist the joy of the occasion into a tragedy no one could have foreseen. The months leading up to the wedding were filled with excitement and planning, but for Ananya, they also carried the weight of a secret she could not share. When she had first traveled to Australia to meet James's family, she had been nervous about making a good impression. James's father, Charles, was the first to put her at ease. He was a man of presence, tall, confident, with a commanding way of speaking that drew people in. His success in business had earned him respect in their community, and he carried himself like someone used to being admired. At first, Ananya admired him in the same way any daughter-in-law might admire a father figure, but that admiration soon shifted into something more dangerous. Their connection began with harmless conversations. Charles asked about her family, her culture, and her dreams. He showed a genuine interest in her life, listening with a level of focus that felt intoxicating. When James was busy with work, Charles filled the silence, offering companionship and advice. What began as comfort slowly edged into something far more personal. Their exchanges became longer, stretching into late evenings. Ananya found herself drawn to him in ways she could not explain, captivated by his confidence and the sense of maturity he carried. The first time boundaries were crossed, it happened subtly. A compliment lingered too long, a touch on the hand that stayed for more than a moment. Ananya felt conflicted, but the attention awakened something she had not felt before. Charles, for his part, seemed emboldened by her hesitation, pushing gently at first, then with more intent. Soon, conversations became secretive, messages exchanged late at night, hidden away where no one would see. Both of them knew it was forbidden, yet the very nature of its secrecy made it feel more intense. For Charles, the affair gave him a renewed sense of vitality. He was a man past his prime, but in Ananya he found excitement, a reminder of youth and passion. For Ananya, it was more complicated. She cared for James and wanted the marriage to succeed, yet she could not deny the pull she felt toward his father. Each time she thought about ending it, Charles found a way to draw her back in, convincing her that their connection was unique, something neither of them could ignore. As the wedding approached, the tension deepened. Ananya moved through the celebrations with a smile that convinced everyone she was the perfect bride. But inside she carried guilt and confusion. Her heart raced whenever Charles entered the room, and their stolen glances did not go unnoticed by her own conscience. Every step closer to the ceremony felt like a step deeper into a dangerous trap. Charles too struggled to hide his obsession. He hovered near Ananya whenever possible, disguising his presence as fatherly pride. To outsiders, he looked like a supportive father, proud of his son's choice, but beneath the surface, his emotions were twisted, bound tightly to a secret that could destroy everything. By the time the wedding day arrived, the weight of the hidden affair pressed heavily on Ananya. She smiled for the cameras, exchanged vows with James, and played the role of the perfect bride. But behind her eyes, there was a storm. She had bound herself to a husband she cared for, yet her heart remained entangled with his father. It was a dangerous duality, one that could not last without consequence. And though no one could see it yet, the choices made in those hidden moments had already set the stage for tragedy. The wedding day unfolded like a fairy tale for everyone who watched from the outside. The guests admired the lavish decorations, the music, and the laughter that filled the air. Ananya wore a bright smile, her traditional bridal attire shimmering under the lights, while James looked proud to call her his wife. Cameras captured every moment of joy, and the families exchanged hugs as if nothing could ever disturb their happiness. Yet beneath the surface of this picture-perfect celebration, emotions churned that no one could see. For Ananya and Charles, every glance across the room carried a weight of desire and secrecy, and every brief touch in the crowd risked exposing them. As evening gave way to night, the reception slowed, and the newlyweds prepared to leave for their suite. Guests offered their blessings, clinking glasses and wishing the couple a lifetime of happiness. James, overwhelmed by the love and attention, laughed easily, but Ananya's smile faltered when she caught sight of Charles in the crowd. He raised his glass to her, a gesture that to others looked harmless, but to her carried a private message. It reminded her of the hidden passion they had shared and the danger that lingered between them. The hotel suite was decorated with petals and soft candlelight, arranged carefully by staff for the newlyweds' first night together. James was full of excitement, eager to celebrate the beginning of their married life. For him, the night represented love, intimacy, and the promise of a future. But for Ananya, the room felt like a cage. She carried the guilt of every secret meeting with Charles, and as James leaned closer to her with tenderness, she felt her mind pulled in another direction. Charles, meanwhile, found himself restless in his own room. The idea of his son spending the night with Ananya filled him with jealousy and unease. He had told himself repeatedly that the marriage would change nothing between them, that Ananya's vows to James were only a public mask, hiding the truth of her feelings for him. But as he pictured her in the bridal suite with his son, his thoughts twisted into anger and obsession. The idea of losing her entirely was unbearable, and with each passing hour, his emotions became more dangerous. Inside the suite, James poured champagne and tried to make the evening light-hearted. He spoke about the future they would build together, their plans to visit India for a second ceremony, and the life they would share as husband and wife. Ananya listened, nodding at the right moments, but her mind was elsewhere. The sound of his voice faded into the background, replaced by the gnawing tension of what she had done. Her heart beat faster, not with excitement, but with dread. As midnight approached, the contrast between appearances and reality sharpened. James believed he was living a dream, while Ananya's every breath felt heavy with secrets. Charles's footsteps echoed in the hallway as he wandered dangerously close to the suite, his mind consumed by thoughts he could no longer control. The wedding night, meant to symbolize unity and joy, had instead become the fragile stage on which betrayal, jealousy, and obsession stood side by side. Neither Ananya nor Charles realized that their secret had reached a point where it could not remain hidden. The choices made in whispers and shadows were about to erupt into consequences far darker than either of them could imagine. The night that was meant to seal a marriage instead unraveled into chaos and bloodshed. As James drifted into a calm, hopeful state, believing his new life was just beginning, Ananya felt a storm tightening inside her chest. She excused herself briefly, stepping out of the suite into the hallway for air. What she did not expect was to find Charles waiting, his eyes burning with the intensity of a man who could not contain himself any longer. The corridors of the hotel were quiet, but the silence only amplified the tension between them. Charles confronted her with words that carried both desperation and anger. He accused her of slipping away, of abandoning what they had shared now that she was married. Ananya tried to reason with him, but the atmosphere had shifted. He was not simply a man torn by passion. He was a man cornered by his own obsession. He insisted that their connection was too strong to deny, and that he would not allow James to take her away completely. His hands shook as he spoke, and though Ananya pleaded for him to calm down, his mind had already begun spinning toward violence. The door to the suite opened suddenly, and James stepped into the hallway, confused by what he saw. He had trusted Ananya completely, but the sight of his bride and his father standing so close in the middle of the night struck him like a blow. His confusion quickly gave way to suspicion, and his voice rose with anger. The tension that had been simmering in secret now erupted into the open. Words were exchanged that could never be taken back, and the betrayal James felt burned hotter than anything he had experienced before. Charles reacted with reckless fury. In a flash of madness, he lashed out at his own son. The confrontation escalated into physical violence, fueled by jealousy, shame, and rage. Ananya tried to intervene, but the two men were blinded by their emotions. What began as shouting quickly spiraled into a deadly struggle. James, young and strong, tried to defend himself, but Charles fought with the desperation of someone who had already lost everything. The hallway echoed with the sounds of their fight until a sudden, shocking act ended. James collapsed, lifeless, his eyes wide with disbelief at the betrayal. Ananya froze in horror, realizing what had just happened. Her husband lay on the floor, blood spreading beneath him, and the man who had taken his life stood trembling above him. Charles looked to her for comfort, insisting that this was their only path forward, that James had stood in the way of their love. His voice carried a twisted logic that made Ananya recoil. She no longer saw him as the man who had once charmed her. She saw a killer, dangerous and unhinged. In that moment of terror, Ananya made a choice. Her fear overpowered any lingering attachment, and she turned against him. Grabbing a nearby object, she struck Charles with all the strength she could muster. The impact stunned him, and in her panic, she continued until he lay motionless beside his son. The hallway that had moments before been filled with anger was now quiet again, but the silence was heavier than before. 2 bodies lay on the floor, the result of secrets that had spiraled far beyond control. The night of celebration had ended in double murder, not through planning but through passion, betrayal, and a storm of emotions that no one had foreseen. Ananya stood amidst the carnage, trembling, realizing there was no turning back. She was no longer a bride, no longer a wife, no longer a secret lover. She was the sole survivor of a forbidden love that had destroyed everything it touched. Ananya stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway, her heart pounding so violently that it seemed to echo in her ears. The bodies of James and Charles lay sprawled on the cold carpet, a scene too gruesome and surreal to be real. The scent of blood clung to the air, mixing with the faint aroma of roses that had been scattered earlier to celebrate a union now destroyed. Her hands trembled as she stared at what she had done, what they had all done together. She had entered this night as a bride, but she now stood as the only survivor of a storm of secrets that had left 2 men dead. Panic surged through her body, and every instinct screamed for her to run, yet she could not move. Her mind tried to calculate what would happen next. Should she scream for help? Should she call the police? The thought of confessing filled her with dread. If she admitted the truth, she would be forced to reveal the forbidden affair, the betrayal, the fight, and ultimately her role in Charles's death. She knew no one would believe her version of events, not when she had so much to hide. The walls seemed to close in as she weighed the impossible choices before her. Her first reaction was to try to erase her connection to the scene. She rushed back into the suite, washing the blood from her hands, scrubbing until her skin burned. In the mirror, her reflection looked alien, eyes wide, face pale, her bridal makeup smeared with sweat and tears. She looked like someone possessed, a stranger to herself. When she stepped back into the hallway, the reality of the crime only grew more vivid. There was no escaping the sight of James's lifeless body, his wedding suit soaked with blood, or Charles's stiff form beside him, the man who had pulled her into a web of desire and destruction. The sound of approaching footsteps jolted her into action. She feared discovery in that moment more than anything else. Quickly, she shut the suite door, leaving the bodies behind, and tried to compose herself. She returned to the bed, lying stiffly as if nothing had happened, though every sound in the hallway made her flinch. Hours dragged by like years until, at last, exhaustion pulled her into a restless sleep. But the images followed her into her dreams, and she woke repeatedly with silent screams caught in her throat. The following morning, the nightmare became impossible to conceal. A housekeeper entered the hallway and discovered the scene. Within minutes, chaos erupted. Guests whispered in shock, hotel staff panicked, and the authorities were summoned. Ananya feigned ignorance, acting as though she had woken up to the commotion without any understanding of what had occurred. She clutched at her bridal attire, now wrinkled and disheveled, and allowed her tears to flow freely, knowing that grief could disguise guilt. The police quickly sealed off the area, taking statements and gathering evidence. The fact that both the groom and his father had been killed on the wedding night sent waves of horror through the community. Reporters soon swarmed the hotel, hungry for details of the tragedy. The double murder became headline news within hours, painted as the ultimate wedding gone wrong. To the world outside, Ananya appeared to be a grieving widow, cruelly robbed of her husband on the night of their union. Only she knew the truth that pulsed beneath the surface, threatening to unravel her carefully constructed mask. Detectives began their investigation with vigor, determined to untangle what had happened. At first, suspicion naturally fell on outsiders. Could it have been a robbery gone wrong? A jealous ex-lover of Ananya's from India? A business rival of Charles? These theories were all considered, yet none seemed to fit. The scene had been too intimate, too personal. The fact that the bodies were found so close together suggested a confrontation rather than a planned attack. Still, no clear motive emerged, and Ananya's grief-stricken act convinced many that she was simply another victim of a cruel twist of fate. Behind closed doors, however, the detectives began to question inconsistencies. Why had Ananya not heard the struggle outside her door? Why were there no signs of forced entry? Why had Charles been near the bridal suite so late at night? The pieces did not align neatly, and whispers of something darker began to circulate within the investigative team. For Ananya, the days following the murders blurred into one another. She attended the funerals with trembling hands, surrounded by mourners who pitied her. She wore black, her face veiled, and allowed herself to cry in public, though her tears were not always for James. At times, she found herself mourning Charles too, despite the horror of what he had done. Their connection had been toxic, destructive, but it had also been real, and its absence left a hollow ache that mixed with her guilt. She was trapped between conflicting emotions, unable to reconcile the roles she had played, as victim, accomplice, and killer. The investigation stretched on for weeks, each day bringing the possibility of exposure. Forensic evidence was meticulously analyzed, security footage reviewed, and witness statements re-examined. Yet the deeper the detectives dug, the more elusive the truth became. No clear fingerprints beyond the expected ones were found, and the lack of cameras in the hallway left gaps that could not be filled. Ananya's performance as a grieving bride became her shield, convincing many that she was incapable of violence. But not everyone was convinced. One detective in particular noticed her inconsistencies moments, when her sorrow seemed rehearsed, answers that felt too carefully chosen. He suspected that the truth was far more complicated than it appeared, but suspicion alone was not enough. Without hard evidence, the case remained frustratingly incomplete. Eventually, the official narrative settled into one of tragic mystery. The report suggested that a heated argument between father and son had spiraled out of control, resulting in both men's deaths. Whether it had been a murder-suicide or a violent accident was left unresolved. The media clung to the sensational aspects of the case, labeling it the wedding night tragedy. Ananya was portrayed as the unfortunate bride, caught in circumstances beyond her control. The world sympathized with her, unaware of the storm of guilt she carried within. Years later, the truth remained buried in her memory, a secret she carried alone. Outwardly, she rebuilt her life, moving away from the city, changing her surroundings, and creating a new identity far from the whispers of the past. But no matter how far she traveled, she could not escape the images of that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw James's face as he realized the betrayal, Charles's desperate eyes before the final blow, and the blood that stained at the beginning of her married life. The murders left scars that no amount of time could heal. For the world, it was a mystery that faded into the archives of crime history. For Ananya, it was a living nightmare, a constant reminder that secrets have the power to destroy, and that forbidden love, once unleashed, can end not in passion but in ruin. She lived each day with the knowledge that the truth had been twisted into silence, and that the wedding meant to unite two families had instead torn everything apart in the most horrific way possible.